Hi, I'm Lawrence Parker Brown. Welcome to the Inside Network. Welcome to this INDepth. We'll be looking at the forces shaping the future of investing. And to explore this big theme, I'm delighted to be joined by the head of Real Assets, Nick Langley. Nick, thanks for your time.
Pleasure. How are you?
Very well. You've written a brilliant paper, and let's explore the key arguments. The first is that for the last 30 years or so, investors were rewarded for a paradigm of thinking, what's a more efficient economy, society, investment opportunity? You're proposing that that needs to change, and actually the sentiment and the mindset should be we're in a more fragile economy, and we should be thinking about what asset type is indispensable. Can you expand on this concept?
Yeah. So, think of it as moving from an efficiency regime to a resilience regime, right? So in the old days, under the efficiency approach, we would say, okay, what is the cheapest way to produce this widget, and to sell it, and you never used to worry about the transport and other potential interruptions. But those are the things that cost you money. And so, as we move into, a different type of world and those interruptions become more regular, then you need to step back and say, well, okay, it may not be just the efficiency approach that I need to have as an organizing principle. Maybe I need to move a little more into a resilience approach. Now, yes, investors still care about margins. They still care about returns. But ultimately, if you think about it from a system setup and from a resilience setup, then you're saying, okay, I'm going to reduce the potential costs of interruptions to me over time. And so we step back and say, all right, let's think about it from a systems perspective. And if it's power systems, it's you've got to generate the power, you've got to transmit it, distribute it, store it, and so on. It increasingly leads us to physical assets and the resilience of physical assets and systems as an organizing principle.
Part of your premise is that there are 5 powerful forces shaping the investment landscape today. What are they, and what do you think investors are misunderstanding?
Everybody knows about the forces. Investors kind of think about them individually, right? Our premise is it's actually part of a framework, and you need to take that framework into account as you think about investing, particularly in real assets going forward. So when we work through the factors, obviously geopolitics is a big one. The world, whether it's state-on-state competition or competition between regions, is becoming less stable than it has been for a long period of time, and that's resulting in a whole series of disruptions to trade, to energy flows, and the like, travel. And so that's an area that we expect to continue going forward. National politics is a really important one. If you think about the geopolitics as kind of the external order in Dalio terms, and national politics as the internal order, that's about what's going on, what are the debates that are occurring inside of countries in the political systems. And we are seeing very similar issues, particularly across developed markets. It's housing affordability, it's cost of living, it's energy costs, it's economic security and national security, for that matter. And that is driving a series of policy decisions at government level, which is obviously really important for investors. It's also driving governments to be more interventionist in the way they're managing their economies and trying to direct investment in their economies. And then you look to the climate side, and we've often talked about, climate in transition terms, energy transition and the like, but it's more than that, it's much broader. You need to think about it in terms of mitigation of the effects of climate change, as well as adaptation of our networks, our physical assets to that climate change as well. And then, there's the obvious one, which is in everybody's mind, is tech and AI. And AI in particular is going to have an enormous effect across our economies. I think that's become obvious now. And then finally, there's debt levels across government, across households, across corporate sector, depending on which country you're looking at. And that changes the dynamic a bit, particularly in countries where we see quite indebted governments, because governments cannot afford to undertake the level of investment in the physical infrastructure and so on that's required. And so they're trying to direct private capital into that space. And that's been done, sometimes with a carrot, sometimes with a stick. We've got some soft capital controls and so on coming through, but that is changing the dynamic for investors as they're looking at infrastructure. We talk a lot about national capital investing in national assets, and I think that will be a big trend over the coming decade or two.
AI is the dominant investment theme of the decade to come, but perhaps not only investing in the technology. Where else can the capital move?
A lot of people think about AI from a software perspective. I type a question in, it goes out, I get an answer back. There's a lot of physical infrastructure that's involved in that process. So if you think, once it leaves your computer, it's across data networks, and then if you're using corporate data or whatever, that might be into a cloud data center, and then it's into an AI data center, and then it's got to come back through the data networks. And when you think about those networks, it's a combination of fiber cables. It might be subsea if it's going to to a different country, or it might go into a satellite network, and you've got uplinks and communication base stations and the like. So a lot of infrastructure in the communication side. Then on the data centers themselves, particularly the AI data centers, they're incredibly power hungry. They do use a lot of water, but not as much as people think, right? So today all the data centers in the US use about 30 times less water as the golf courses in the US, for example. But the power side of it is incredibly demanding. And so, the forecast for the US are to add about 10 gigawatt a year of data centers. That is literally the load of New York City. And so we're adding New York City to the grid every year for the next 5 or 6 years. And of course, that's not the most expensive part of the data centers. That's the chips. And that's a manufacturing process in and of itself, the raw materials, the fabs, and all the rest of it. And so when we think about AI and technology, in the last cycle, it was about all of the intangibles. It was about the code, the platforms, the IP, and the like. This cycle, it's going to be about the physical infrastructure. That will be the constraint to the growth of the technology. And so I think we're going to see a significant amount of capital pointed toward the physical assets and those systems again to be able to run the technology and hopefully generate benefit for the economy.
So Nick, you've argued in your recent paper that investors should think about not just the traditional portfolio construction techniques, but an investment company should start thinking about a systems-led modality. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so we talked about the 5 powerful forces, and in my view, they can be wrapped together in a framework that allows investors to kind of connect or assess different investment opportunities. And when we talk about traditional investment, we kind of start with asset classes, and we've got a series of buckets and so on, and then we kind of talked for a bit about thematic investing, and so we had narratives and themes and so on. But they can be pretty broad, they can be imprecise. And so the idea behind the systems-led is for the IC to say, okay, what essential system is under stress or under pressure? And then which assets will relieve some of that pressure or provide resilience to that system? And systems are concrete, right? You've got physical assets that are joined together. Often they've got regulatory overlays because in our space there's a lot of monopoly assets and so on. They've got cash flows, they've got counterparties and so on. So it's identifiable and you can underwrite it. If you think about that in the context of, say, the water industry in the UK, where the water companies are tasked by their regulator to source the water, to run the filtration and add the chemicals and the filtering and so on, and then distribute that water to households and then collect the wastewater, obviously, and process that wastewater. It's a nice closed system. It's all covered by the same regulatory arrangement. And it's a clear example of that kind of systems-led investing, and each part of that system is critical. Now, that system is under incredible stress at the moment. And so, in this regulatory round, the companies are increasing their asset bases by something in the order of 60%. And they obviously get a return on all of that investment. And so here, you've got a closed system covered by one regulatory arrangement that is under stress, and it's an excellent place for investors to provide capital and earn a great return. And so, take that step back. It says, all right, what is this asset achieving in terms of an essential system or an essential flow within an economy?
There are different investment regimes, and you're arguing that the one we're entering into is about to create new winners, but also structurally less appealing assets. Can you capture where you think some portfolios might be facing yesterday's world as opposed to tomorrow's?
In this systems-led approach, we're trying to get exposure to assets that improve the functioning of essential systems. And that might be improving the resilience, it might be removing bottlenecks and so on. But it's about systems across the different sectors of real assets and infrastructure. And so if we think about it from that perspective, systems around transport, around pipelines, around communications, good. Point-to-point assets, they might be a little challenged. They're the sorts of ones that could be interrupted and would be, have great difficulty in mitigating some of those interruptions. The other thing about systems assets is, a lot of systems are perpetual, right? Grids, for example. And the components of the grid will get swapped out over time, but when they're fully depreciated, you're replacing them. You're continuing to invest into that space, which gives you great longevity in that investment exposure in that system that you have. And that's a recipe for ensuring that investors are making great returns for a long period of time.